So it's Parshas Vayetze. It opens up telling us Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva and Yaakov went out. He departed from Be'er Sheva Vayelech Haran and he went to Haran. First of all, we already know this because at the end of last week's Parsha, we know that Rivka came to Yitzchak and, sort of, let's say, in a sense, manipulated him into sending Yaakov away from Be'er Sheva to go to Haran. The reason that she did that was because when I say manipulated, it was a manipulation of sorts with the intent to protect Yitzchak and the image that he had of Esav. Rather than telling Yitzchak, because Yitzchak had a soft spot for Esav. Esav had pulled off this master deception his entire life, and Yitzchak thought that Esav was this good guy, and that continued up until this point. And so Rivka, rather than telling Yitzchak, by the way, your son Esav is a terrible person and he's planning to actually literally kill his twin brother Yaakov, which obviously would have been catastrophic for Yitzchak to find that out. So instead, she sort of manipulated him into sending Yaakov away to go to Haran to find a wife. And so that's what happened. Yitzchak sent him away and he left. So we already know that Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and went to Haran. This week's Pasha opens up again and tells us, Vayetze Yaakov Be'er Sheva v'yelech Haran, and Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and went to Haran. So what we have is this piece of information which we already know, and the Torah doesn't repeat anything ever unnecessarily, right? If you look in the Oral Torah, in Rambam, in Gemara, in the development of halacha, you'll see that there are halachas that we learn today that we actually practically keep in Shulchan Aruch, laws, customs, etc., that are inferred from the pasuk's choice of spelling a word. With a vav, without a vav, with an extra aleph, with an extra yud, without it, right? When there are multiple ways of spelling. Adding in an extra word, the pasuk's choice of how to word things, wording it, saying it in a way that's slightly less concise than absolutely necessary. The rule is the written Torah is as concise as possible. There isn't one extra letter there that is unnecessary. So if you're ever reading something and there is even a letter, let alone a word, and certainly a whole pasuk, a whole sentence that seems to be unnecessary, it seems to be redundant. We just read like 5 verses back that Yaakov left to go to Haran. If we see what seems to be a whole extra pasuk, we need to stop and ask ourselves, what's this doing here? Right? There are some people that they're not particular about the way they talk necessarily, and sometimes they're sloppy, sometimes they repeat themselves, and if they repeat themselves, like, okay, they repeated themselves, whoop-de-doo. Right? But if there's someone who you know has a reputation, not just a reputation, you know that this person has a history of being extremely precise about the way they speak, and they measure every word before they say it, if this person says something, either something that seems like a strange thing to say, maybe your initial assumption would be they chose the wrong word, let's say, and then you say to yourself, hang on a second, this person always calculates every single word carefully. Maybe before I assume that they chose the wrong word, let me stop and ask myself, am I misunderstanding what they're saying, or am I missing something here? Because the record is that they don't use the wrong word, or if someone has a history of speaking very precisely, and it seems like very concisely and measured, and it seems like they're just rambling, or they're repeating themselves, it might be a good idea to ask ourselves, hang on, why are they repeating themselves? There's going to be a reason. Right? So the Torah is that. The written Torah is extraordinarily measured, calculated, and always as concise as possible. So if there is a whole sentence here that seems to be just repeating something that it said 5 verses earlier, there has to be a good reason. And one of the things that the Torah is doing here in repeating this statement is attaching this statement to this week's Parsha, so that this statement, it's not just a piece of information that we need to be aware of. It's a piece of information that, in addition to a historical fact that we need to be aware of, it's a historical fact that is of particular relevance to the whole collective message of this week's Torah portion, and particularly as the opening sentence. So the fact that this happened, the fact that Yaakov left Beersheba to go to Haran, we already know. But there is something that we are going to walk away with as a result of hearing it, seeing it, reading it, as the opening sentence of this week's parsha. That is something we would completely miss if we just think of it as a historical fact and part of the story. So what is this week's parsha? This week's parsha is Yaakov leaves Haran, leaves Beersheba, goes to Haran, and he has this whole complicated relationship with Lavan and his uncle, and he works for him, basically they have a contract. Yaakov wants to marry Lavan's daughter, Rachel. They make a contract. He works 7 years, marry her. He gets jibbed, marries Leah, has to work another 7 years to marry Rachel. And basically we have this story of his time there, his 20 years there. He worked, he established a family, he got married, he had children. That is the story of the parsha. And for some reason, it's very important that the opening sentence of this story of Yaakov going, getting settled, establishing his family, well, not getting settled so much necessarily as being the point, but establishing his family, the opening sentence of the story of Yaakov establishing his family, having his children, raising his children, etc., is, and Yaakov left Beersheba and he went to Haran. And it's very counterintuitive because it seems to be the opposite of what you would think. Beersheba is a place where he was living with his father Yitzchak. What did he do? He sat, he studied Torah, there was no drama, everything was calm, everything was settled, everything was smooth sailing, and there were no issues. Oh, there were some issues, but primarily he sat and learned. It was a dream for the spiritually inclined. He sat, he could daven, he could pray, he could, meditate and think about divinity and his purpose and all these things as much time as he wanted. He could sit and study Torah as much time as he wanted. There were no issues. And then he goes to Haran, right? And the name tells us everything we need to know. The sages say that it's called Haran because Charon Af means fury, anger. This city was Charon Af Shalelam. This was the most infuriating, terrible, morally bankrupt place in the world at the time. So somehow the message is that the opening sentence of Yaakov going, if someone's going to build a family, wants to think of a place, where's the ideal place to raise a family? Oh, let me find the most morally bankrupt place in the world and go do it there. That's where I want to raise my children. Interesting choice. And the message isn't necessarily that when one wants to raise a family, they should go and look for the most morally decrepit place to do it. But what the message is, part of that message is, and there are going to be a few distinct stages here and distinct lessons. In the bigger picture, what does establishing a family and raising children represent? It represents life. Right? It represents living life, doing what we're here to do, the bigger picture, looking forward. And one might think that in order to live my life and to, be the person I'm here to be and to have the impact on the world that I'm here to have and to raise a family, etc., what I need to do is to go to Beersheba, to go to a place where or not even so much the place, but to isolate myself and just study Torah and just daven and just make sure that I'm very isolated and not involved in the world. Because that's what I have to do, to keep my family safe. Now, obviously, practically speaking, it's wise when a person is both for one's family and children and for oneself. It's wise to be intentional about where we choose to settle, where we choose to live, think about the influences. But to run away, to think we need to run away and isolate ourselves and say, well, I can only succeed at raising a family of healthy, spiritually inclined children, spiritually connected children, if we hide away somewhere and don't interact with the world and we don't, have anything to do with anyone that's not, very spiritually cocooned. That's a mistake. And it has to be a mistake because there are two things here, both of which are, in a sense, fundamentally either we could say what we're here to do or a huge part of what we're here to do. And these two things are, one of them is to, right, it says in the pasuk, says in the verse, Loi toyo v'ra l'sheves yitzara. Hashem did not create the world to be empty, to be desolate. L'sheves yitzara. Hashem created the world to be populated. Hashem wants populations to continue. Hashem, part of what we're here to do is to contribute towards the continued population of the world, aka establish a family. That's a very, very, very prominent part of what we're here to do. Another very, very, very prominent part of what we're here to do, and in a sense it's actually the metaphorical equivalent, is, let's go back to that. What does it mean to establish a family? Let's talk technically for a second. Establishing a family is a nice, narratively oriented way of saying produce and raise offspring. Right? If we want to be technical, biologically, what's the biological function that a person is fulfilling when they're raising a family? They're producing and raising offspring. What are offspring? Offspring spring off. Offspring, children are derivatives. They are an outcome that one produces, right? Children are the offspring of the parents. They are generated by the parents. They are a contribution going forward to the world that is produced by the parents. They spring off of the parents, offspring. There is also non-biological offspring, progeny, that we produce, that we contribute, that we generate, and that is the outcomes of our thoughts, our words, and our actions. Mitzvahs, the integration of divinity into the world that we achieve every time we do what we're supposed to do, we are producing a product, contributing offspring, progeny, non-biological, we could say, or spiritual offspring into the world. The extent to which we can do that if we hide away in a corner and just daven, pray, study Torah all day and don't do anything else is very, very, very limited. I cannot integrate divinity directly into the street if I don't go there. And this does become a very delicate balance. Because obviously it's not a good idea for everyone to say, I am going to expose myself to all the worst influences in the world because I want to integrate divinity. I'm going to go into, a basement somewhere in a back street of Manhattan where people are, snorting cocaine and doing who knows what else, because I want to integrate divinity there. Probably not the best choice for most people, or anyone. Let me say that. I doubt there's anyone who should be going there. I'm going to go there, I'm going to drink some water, I'm going to make a bracha, I'm going to say some tehillim. You know what? Find another place to do that. Obviously, I'm choosing something absurdly extreme just to illustrate the point that yes, boundaries are important and necessary. But the opposite extreme of everything being just boundaries and protection and isolating ourselves from the world also restricts or eliminates almost our ability to or severely limits our ability to produce that spiritual progeny, to integrate divinity into the world, into the matter, into worldly experiences, into worldly processes. Hashem created the world, and with all the different types of nature, and by types of nature I mean there's the physics and there's a biological nature, and there's also, there's economics is a form of nature also, and there's the social structure and the way things work is a kind of nature also. Hashem created all these things. Hashem created human nature. Hashem created the laws of economics and how these things work. All of this is part of nature. The more we interact with the world as a person who's a functioning, responsible, interactive member of society participating in the world, the greater the extent to which we can integrate divinity into all of these things. The more parts of the world we interact with, the more parts of the world we have the opportunity to integrate divinity into. So, in one sense, the more the better. Now, yes, it's a good idea for everyone to have some seichel, for everyone to be self-aware and to have boundaries, because for everyone there's a point at which integrating beyond this point gets into a territory where the risk of things going south outweighs the benefit, right? Everything comes down to a cost-benefit analysis or a risk-benefit analysis. Right, and there are some places, let's say, for example, that maybe I could go and it wouldn't even occur to me that I shouldn't be there. Obviously not anything that's halachically an issue, but it's like, whatever, I could go there, I could talk to someone, I could put tefillin on, I could have a conversation with someone, I could try to uplift someone, I could eat and make a bracha, I could do a mitzvah there. And maybe someone else would be like, oh, I don't do well in that environment based on my experience or my personality or all of the above or whatever it is, it's not a good idea for me to go there. You know what? That's a very healthy thing to be aware of. Yes, we should be healthily self-aware and realize that if any particular situation, environment, circumstance has a substantial risk that we're going to end up behaving negatively or having an undesirable outcome, then chances are that's not my job. Hashem will find someone else to go there and to do whatever needs to be done there. But any part of the world that I can interact with, right? We all walk past people on the street who are maybe not the nicest person. We all, negativity is not something we need to be afraid of. And as long as we're not putting ourselves in a situation that for us is a high risk situation spiritually, then the greater the extent to which we can interact with the world and all the different natures and parts of nature of the world, the better. And so these two things go hand in hand. Yaakov was going to literally, again in a very technical sense, to produce and raise his physical, biological offspring. What goes hand in hand with that, what's appropriate thing that goes hand in hand with that, is at the same time emphasizing, producing, and raising spiritual, non-biological offspring. Integrating divinity into the world, creating that impact, creating that legacy, the spiritual legacy. And so Yaakov, and keep in mind, who are we? We are called Bnei Yisroel, the sons of Yisrael. Who's Yisrael? Yaakov. We're generally not referred to as Bnei Avram. Sometimes we're called Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But generally, the primary term that's used to refer to us is not Bnei Avram. Avram had Yitzchak and Yishmael. We specifically are the legacy and the progeny of Yitzchak, not Yishmael. Yitzchak had Yaakov and Esav. We are specifically the progeny and legacy of Yaakov, not of Esav. Yaakov didn't have any child. There was no branch off for Yaakov. There was no child who was like, no, that's not part of the legacy. That's not part of my primary, let's say, legacy, progeny. Yaakov had 12 sons. Every single one of them is equally part of the picture. Every single one of them is one of the tribes. We are Bnei Yisrael. Yisrael is Yaakov's second name. So one of the things that Yaakov had, in a sense, that Avram and Yitzchak both didn't have, is all of his progeny were part of his legacy. He didn't have any offspring that were like the part of the family tree that's like out to the side, that's not really who we want to focus on or part of our primary legacy. Right? Yaakov didn't have that. What was the thing that Yaakov did to earn and to achieve having a family where every single one of his children was part of the picture, was part of his legacy. There was no one there who, had to be that side branch in the family tree. It might seem intuitive that the way to do that would be to go hide away somewhere and just learn Torah and daven and meditate all day. That would be a reasonable mistake to make. It's not unreasonable, and it would be coming from a good place, but it is a mistake. Because progeny goes together with progeny, legacy goes together with legacy, offspring goes together with offspring. And to focus on one kind of offspring or progeny at the expense of the other, if we look at them as two equivalents, we have our biological or physical equivalent and the spiritual, non-physical, non-biological equivalent. The biological equivalent being biological children, the non-physical equivalent being our spiritual progeny, our spiritual offspring, mitzvahs, Torah, integrating divinity into the world. If they are two equivalents, it makes sense, they go together, and if we're going to choose either one at the expense of the other, then we're kind of missing the point, because they're two sides of the same coin. They're the biological, physical, biological, and non-physical sides of the same coin. And so Yaakov, in going to Haran and saying, if this is where I'm sent, if this is where I have been sent, I am not afraid, I will go there, I will integrate divinity into every part of this city and every part of its economy and society to the extent that I am able to. I will create my spiritual progeny, offspring, legacy to the extent that I am able to. That came along with him producing his biological offspring, progeny, legacy flawlessly, unlike his father and grandfather, both of whom had that side branch on the family tree. So, and again, obviously in reality there's a delicate balance, and we have to be self-aware and have a degree of caution about not putting ourselves in situations that are a bad idea. That being said, there's a Chazal say that a person shouldn't say, I don't want to do this avera. Avera is disgusting. It's like, no, let's be real and acknowledge I'm a human being, and it says ifshi in Aramaic means I want it. I would love to eat that food or to do this thing or, whatever it is, to check my phone and smoke a cigarette on Shabbos. I would not like to smoke a cigarette on Shabbos, and I'm glad that I can't use my phone on Shabbos, but I can't say there's a part of me that wouldn't want to if I could. But what a person should say is, yeah, I'm human. I would love to do that thing, but I can't. Hashem said so. That's a general rule. But there is an exception, and the exception is if there's something that a person really struggles with, whatever it might be, a food that, especially if it's something that someone has experienced and then separated themselves from, a particular food, a kind of activity, a certain temptation, whatever it is, if it's something that's a very real struggle for someone, there is no mitzvah to harp on about how much I really, really want it, but Hashem said no. Because if I'm generating a risk of predisposing myself to maybe messing up, maybe failing, maybe having an undesirable outcome, it's perfectly fine in that case for a person to say, you know what, no, I don't want it. We have permission and a recommendation to convince ourselves that we don't want it if it's something that we are at a particular risk for. Right? So yes, we have to be self-aware. Yes, we have to be practical and have common sense. But as long as something is on our side of that line where there becomes a real risk, the more the better. There's no mitzvah to hide away and to isolate ourselves. The more we integrate, the better. And there is no need for concern that integrating ourselves and our lives into the world in a healthy, sensible way is going to come at the expense of our legacy and the desirability of the outcomes for our children, as we see that Yaakov was the first in his family to not have that side branch in the family tree. And this week's Torah, which is the story of him raising and establishing his family, specifically repeats this piece of information to tell us that. The opening sentence of the story of Yaakov raising his family is, Yaakov left Be'er Sheva, he left the isolated, secluded, peaceful, spiritual life, Vayelech Charan, and he went to Charan. He was not afraid to go where he was supposed to go, which was a place that was morally bankrupt. And because he was prepared to go there, or not because, but despite the conditions that he was subjecting himself to, he actually had the let's say, the cleanest, in a sense, we could call it. Maybe it's not the greatest choice of words, but his offspring, his children, his progeny were all aligned with his values, let's say, as opposed to Avraham and Yitzchak. So now, let's take a look then at... So now we know that Yaakov, we have this lesson, and the Torah repeats this to let us know that Yaakov going to Haran is the foundation and the opening sentence and the opening important, relevant piece of information to the story of him establishing and raising his family. So let's look to what else we see about the sequence of events and the way that Yaakov went about this, and maybe we can get some insight. So what's the first thing that he did? Vayetze Yaakov mi-Be'er Sheva v'yelech Haran. Yaakov left Be'er Sheva v'yelech Haran. He went to Haran. Vayifka b'makom, and he encountered the place. And what he did when he encountered the place, what that refers to is he stopped and he davened. He prayed. Now, obviously, davening is important. Prayer is important. Being spiritually connected and grounded is important. But what's Yaakov doing now? What's he embarking on? He's embarking on a journey to go to a city that is the diametric opposite of where he was coming from, socially, morally, everything. He was going to have to be deeply immersed in the culture and economy of that city for decades. He was going to be going to, to get married, to raise children, to raise a family. It would, again, be very reasonable and intuitive, the thing you would think, okay, I'm going to a new city, new society, different society, new culture, new language, completely different kind of people. I'm going to go and live there for 2 decades and raise my kids there, find someone from there to marry and raise a family. It's probably a good idea to get on Google and look up this society and their culture and their economy and their lifestyle and all of these things and get familiar. That's a very, very reasonable and practical thing to prioritize. And the truth is that it is. There's nothing about that that's incorrect. The mistake would be, what would be a mistake would be to think that that is the number one priority. To think that that is the first and or most important thing that we need to do. That would be a very big mistake. What is the first and most important thing to do? The first and most important thing to do is obviously going to be the thing that is going to be primarily responsible for whether or not we succeed, right? If something is the primary factor in determining our success, that would be the number one priority and the first thing we want to allocate time, energy, resources to. Now again, it would be a forgivable mistake for someone to think, well, what's going to make or break my success? How well I understand the culture and all of these things. Researching those things would be a responsible thing to do. But the one and only one factor that actually determines the outcome is Hashem. Now yes, Hashem, again, going back to what we just talked about, Hashem created the world and placed us in the world so that we could live a practical, natural, responsible, integrated life as a human being in the world, which means being responsible is the right thing to do. When there's research to be done, doing the research is the right thing to do. But the reason we have to be responsible is because Hashem says that we have to be responsible. Now, just to clarify, because I could see that being totally misunderstood, as if there's nothing intrinsically positive about being a responsible person, and if Hashem didn't tell us we have to be responsible, then we just wouldn't have to bother to be responsible. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the reason that it's important for us to be responsible as part of producing desired outcomes. Yaakov's going to Haran, he wants to succeed. It would be responsible to find out what he can about the culture and the society, etc. The reason why that's a necessary part of the process is because Hashem said it's a necessary part of the process. Hashem could have said, you pray, you ask what you want, you learn your Torah and do your mitzvahs, and I will make the magic, wave the magic wand and make everything just be perfect. Hashem could have said that, could have set things up that way, and then that would be the way that we should behave. But it's not. Hashem says, Hashem just created the world and put us in it so that we should interact with the world in a way that's functional and responsible, etc. That is a huge part of why we're here. But the reason that we're here to do that is because Hashem decided we're here to do that. But ultimately, that's not what determines our success. What determines our success is Hashem. Part of what we have to do as part of the picture is to do that which is responsible because Hashem said so. But it's not the being responsible that determines the success. Being responsible is just about us doing what we have to do because Hashem said so. Ultimately, it's not the being responsible that determines the outcome, it's Hashem that determines the outcome. So the number one thing that Yaakov did was, number one on the list, first thing he did was engage in the thing that is going to be the primary factor that will determine the outcome, that will determine success, and that is Hashem. Yaakov went to Haran. Yaakov worked very hard. Yaakov didn't have some, 3 days a week working at home except when he went into Twitter headquarters to get lunch and have a massage and a sleeping pod and then work from home and have 3, mental health days a week. Yaakov worked day and night with his hands, worked hard, brutally hard. Yaakov wasn't someone who was in denial about, the importance of engaging with the world and doing what we need to do. But he also understood that the number one factor that determines the outcome ultimately is Hashem. So before I go and do the work, before I go and behave responsibly, I'm first going to pray to connect to Hashem, to connect to my sense of purpose and meaning, to ask Hashem for blessing and for success. Then, having established that, I will then go. Yaakov then goes to Haran and works hard and behaves responsibly and does all those things, having first done the thing that was the primary and ultimately really the one and only factor that actually determines the outcome. And so again, we have this message here that when we are heading forward into the world to produce our legacy, and this could be both our biological legacy, children, raising a family, it's our legacy, our contribution to the world, our Torah, our mitzvahs, our contributing to the world, integrating divinity into the world. And again, it's every time we do a mitzvah, every time we learn Torah, every time we say something positive, every time we lift someone up. All of those things are our spiritual offspring, our spiritual legacy. When we are going to go out into Haran, into a world, and yes, there is plenty in the world that can distract us. There is plenty in the world that can, pull us in a negative direction if we allow it to. And it is a good idea, again, to be sensible and cautious and not submit ourselves to unnecessary risk. But assuming that we're not crossing that line, the more we integrate, the better. But the one who determines our success in that is Hashem. So step number one is being spiritually connected, spiritually oriented, praying, davening. Right? And this is the way our day is set up also. We get up, we daven first thing, and then we go about our day. It is important to have both, right? Yaakov did start out in Beersheba before he went to Haran. It is important to start both. We set up our lives this way ideally, where we start, right? Everyone here is spending time in Beersheba, getting deeply immersed and set up with this foundation. And then there will be a time for everyone to go out into Haran, to go out into the world and engage the world to produce that legacy. And on every day is a sort of a micro of that, where we start the day with davening, connecting, setting the foundation for the day so that we can go out and encounter Chor and encounter the world with the best chance of success. And one more thing we see here, let's say, and Yaakov came, Vayifka b'makom, Vayolen sham, he rested there. Vayikach me'avnei hamakom, he took from the stones of the place, Vayosem rashosov, he put them around his head. Why did he put them around his head? To protect himself from wild animals. Yes, true, obviously, the head, the brain is the most important part of the body. But if there was a risk for the safety of his head, protecting his head and leaving his arms and legs and torso available to be eaten by whatever, it's not going to help that much, right? If his head is sitting there in the morning and everything else is gone, it's not going to be such a good situation. Why is he just protecting his head? If we look at this metaphorically, right, again, what's the theme here? We're talking about Yaakov going out into the world, engaging, getting involved, being a responsible, contributing member of society, being involved. And it's important to do that properly. If someone, and it's very interesting, there are very, very strict halachas about a person who has a job and is getting paid a salary or getting paid by the hour. There are halachas about lunch breaks, about ways that you are or are not allowed to look at something that's going to be distracted, because if you're being paid for your time belongs to the person who's paying you for it. And to behave irresponsibly, to be distracted, to spend that time doing something other than the work I'm being paid to do is called stealing. If someone gives me a job that requires that I work really, really hard, and I work 5% less hard than my job description says that I agree to for this salary, I am stealing. A person who has a job is supposed to work as hard as necessary to do that job as agreed upon. But what does it mean to work as hard? Working as hard means very practically, right? It says, "Yegia kapecha kisoicha l'ashrecha b'tovlach." The toil of your hands you will eat, you will be fortunate, and it will be good for you. The toil of your hands. We are supposed to engage in the world with our hands, with our feet, with our bodies, and even with our minds. But when it comes to our minds, it's important to be specific. If a person has a job that is an academic or an intellectual job, then if they don't put their mind into the work as much as they agreed to in their contract, they're stealing. That being said, there's a difference between being at work and putting in the effort and working hard with my mind versus this is where my mind is at. And when I open my eyes in the morning, this is what is there. And when I lay down at night and close my eyes, this is what's on my mind. Where is my mind at? If my mind, primarily as a person, not just when I'm at work, if where my mind is at work, is producing income, is, my ambitions, professional ambitions, whatever it is, that's the beginning of the end in terms of staying on track and actually creating a healthy legacy and having a healthy impact on the world, raising a healthy family. Yaakov went to Haran. He worked very hard. He worked hard with his hands and with his feet and with his head. He was very shrewd and careful and thoughtful about his decisions and the way he did things. But even when he was using his mind for work, in a professional sense, it's never where his mind was at, primarily as a person. Where his mind was at was, why am I here? There is a God who put me in the world, and this is my purpose, this is my objective, this is what I'm here for, and this is how I'm going to do it, and I will use my head to do it as much as necessary, as much as is appropriate. But that's never where his mind was really at. That's never where his heart was at. And so Yaakov did not shy away from engaging with the world in the way that he was supposed to. He engaged with the world. Step number one, he knew, was before doing research and being practical and responsible and all of those things, all of which are a good idea and healthy and correct. The first thing he did was pray, was daven, knowing that ultimately the factor that determines whether or not behaving responsibly will pay off, will play out, to a desirable outcome, the one that determines that is Hashem. So that's priority and step number one. And the last step was introducing this precaution, Yaakov taking stones, surrounding his head with them, protecting his head, so that as much as his body got immersed in the wild animals, in the wildness and the craziness of the society and the culture and the economy of Haran, as much as his body, his hands and feet, and his mind, maybe in a functional sense, were very involved, his mind in a personal sense, in terms of what it was immersed in and where it was really at, that was protected the whole time. He had this pile of stones protecting his head, and because his head was protected, that ultimately protects the body also. He was able to go out and to do what he needed to do without veering off track because his head was in the right place. As long as our head is protected, as long as we're going to go out and engage with the world, as long as we make sure to set up our life in the sort of macro, and then each day in the micro, and maybe throughout the day, in even more micro instances, we set things up that we start with the foundation of connectedness, of praying, of knowing, of asking Hashem for blessing, and reminding ourselves of why we're here and what it's really all about. And then we institute these precautions of protecting our head and making sure that as much as our hands, our feet, our bodies, and our minds to the appropriate degree do get involved, but where our mind is really at stays protected. And when we do that, we actually can have a reasonable chance of success to go out, engage with the world, be involved, and for our body, our hands, our feet to stay safe and to succeed in raising that family, creating and cultivating and raising that progeny, creating that legacy, and to do it in a way that our body, our hands, our feet, all of that is protected because our head is protected. Have a good week.